Swanger, the in HBTV. I'm a philosopher who advocates Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. This is a follow-up on last week's show on property rights. The context, just to review, is that all rights are moral, in Ayn Rand's definition, which is correct, are moral principles defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. Property rights are moral principles mandating freedom of action regarding material values, the material values which one owns. The source of property rights is the right to life. If you cannot be free to produce and to consume the results of your production, you cannot live. So, since man is not a ghost or a spirit, but a body with a mind, he has to have the right to own the material values that he produces or earns. How does someone come to own something? Either by transfer from someone who already owns it, or, since that just puts the question back one level, it's produced from materials that he owns, which pushes the question back a level. How do you come to own it? And ultimately produced from unowned materials. So by a long chain, the mouse, the computer mouse that I have here, was produced by a number of companies, starting with the raw material that they make the plastic out of, which is mined or extracted from petrochemicals that come from land owned by the company that produces those materials to be sold to the next company, to be fabricated into the next stage, to be sold and distributed by Logitech, I believe this is, in the final analysis. And then it goes to, let's say, Best Buy is a store here that I buy these in. So it's a long chain of voluntary trade, starting from what's in the land and the labor and capital that is applied to it by human effort. Okay. Where does the ownership right come from to land and to other unowned materials? Even the apple on a tree in an uncharted forest, an unowned land in the United States in 1700, west of the Appalachians. How do you come to own it? Well, you first get the right to use it exclusively. The right goes to the first user. No subsequent user can interfere with a prior user of a previously unowned item. So the act of appropriating it, of picking that apple off the tree, or of squatting on the land, or camping out on the land, gives you the right not to be disturbed, because you have the right to your life while you are using or occupying it. That's use rights. Use rights stem from using something. Where do property rights, titles, and deeds, and permanent ownership come from? They come from permanent use, registered to make it objective that you intend to use this permanently and exclusively. So ownership rights come out, full ownership rights, title and deed and legally protectable ownership is distinguished from temporary transient ownership by making it objective through continuous and exclusive use that you intend to use this permanently, and you don't want anybody else using it even if you move away from it for a while. And there's certain procedures that make it objective, including ultimately when there's a government going to the land office and registering, and if no prior person has registered a deed to that, you get title, you get full property right ownership. Okay, that's all the background for this. That's all that we covered last time. There are very interesting applications of this principle. For instance, do you have the right to drill horizontally or diagonally to get oil that's under somebody else's surface land? Do you have the right to fly a plane over somebody's land? What about polluting? Do you have the right to pollute on your property if it goes on to someone else's property? So we're going to take up those questions either at the end of today or probably in a subsequent show. But we have first some questions arising from last week's presentation. And I'm going to ask Dylan to read them as they came in.
All right, so our first question here is from Michael Sanders. He asked, is the anti-immigration crowd fundamentally motivated by racism? Losing jobs and bankrupting the welfare state are just BS cover stories?
You know, that's a good question. I just had a discussion with a friend who thinks that the fundamental is the zero-sum game approach to wealth. The real fundamental is collectivism. Whether it's, look, this is our wealth, we produced it, which is collectivism, or it's racism. We want to keep the people who look like us in control of this land and living on this land, and we don't want anybody else who looks different or is different ethnicity or race or color or whatever coming in. That's collectivism too. Individualism means you treat individuals as individuals, not as members of the race and not as collective owners of the things inside the country. We don't own this country. You don't own it. I don't own it. I own the land right here around my house. It's all surveyed. I have title to it. I have deed. If you have title and deed to land, you own that land. Now, suppose I want to sell my house to a Mexican. I have the right to do that. You can't object just because you live next door or in the same town or in the same state or in the same nation. You can't, you have no right to control how I use my property. And the fact that there are immigrants bidding for land raises the value of your property. It's something to be welcomed. So an individualist recognizes there is no we. There are just a bunch of individuals, and they each have rights to what is entitled to them by their individual rights, not as, well, we Americans built this country and we're going to keep it. Now, of course, it's a solid economic fallacy to say that they take jobs and so forth. But the question that Michael's asking here, which is the bigger cause? The economic mistakes where they think that there's a certain amount of wealth, we own it, and if someone else comes in, he gets my share. That, which is crazy economics. Or I want the people around here to be of my race and my ethnicity, and I don't like those Mexicans who look different. Racism, that form of collectivism. I guess it differs with different people. I think both factors play in, but they're both forms of collectivism. Now, I'd like to turn to the economic side, because the racism isn't worth arguing about or discussing or analyzing. It's just ugly, tribal, mindless, disgusting prejudice. But the economic errors have something to be said. about. Number one, there are not a fixed amount of jobs. There's unlimited work to be done. There's unlimited amount of wealth that can be created by the application of reason and knowledge to material reality, to shape matter, to serve human purposes, like this mouse, right? There were no, do we say mice or mouses? There were none of these when I was a child. They hadn't been invented. Now there's a big industry making peripherals for computers of this sort because people discovered technological things about computers and about peripherals and about wireless transmission and found out how to produce it cheaply. So there's not 16 million jobs to be done, and if the 16 millionth guy comes in, somebody has to be displaced. I can think of a lot of things I would like to have done for me that I could pay for if there were a bigger population. And I'm sure you can too, if you think about it. Wouldn't you like to have to have a chauffeur, for instance? Wouldn't you like to have a mechanic on call to service your car? Or just somebody to drive it to the gas pump and fill it up every week? Where I walk here in Naples, it doesn't have to be fancy jobs, is my point. Where I walk here in Naples, it's next to a Walmart, and there's a lot of trash along the way, and trash going out into the more public areas outside the Walmart parking lot. I'm thinking, why don't we pay some poor immigrant a small amount? We in the housing development I'm in get together and pay him every day to pick up the trash and put it in the trash can. It would be a trivial expense for us, and it would be a good thing for that person. Of course, with today's regulatory state, you can't do that. So there's unlimited amount of opportunities of jobs that you could think of for people coming in. In fact, right now, there's signs everywhere, we're hiring. The unemployment rate is so low that you can't fill jobs. There are jobs going unfilled. We all know that. If there's ever a time for immigration, it's now. Now, what about the welfare state? Because there's an interesting point to be made about that. There shouldn't be a welfare state, okay? But people say, well, look, we can't repeal the welfare state. And if they come in, they're going to use the public school system. They're going to use the emergency ward system of the city and municipal and state hospitals. And they're going to cause their taxes to go up. You'd think that's a pretty reasonable idea, right? I mean, I did until I thought about this. Wait a minute. Are you suggesting that the amount of money the government extracts from the citizens has something to do with the legitimate need for goods and services that the government supplies? Wrongly, there shouldn't be public education. But it's bananas to think that the amount of money taxes for education has something to do with the number of pupils. You could multiply the number of pupils by tenfold, and it wouldn't cause any change in the budget for education. You could cut it by tenfold, and the teachers' union and the powers that be would still say we have to have more money for education, and they would still go on raising the amount of money that they take from you in education. As long as the racket is there, as long as they can guilt people into paying more to the government, it will happen. And the limit of the government expenditures is the limit they can squeeze out of the people before they're voted out of office, before the people catch on to the inflation, which is one way of raising money, or the rebel against the level of taxation. So It's not true that extra immigrants coming in, which are a very small percentage of the population already here, causes, oh gosh, gee, we used to have class size of 30, now we have a class size of 32 because 30 million immigrants came in, which never happened. But so we have to hire more teachers, or we have to build more schools, that's not the way the system works. That's naive. It's much more corrupt than that. So it would be an argument against letting immigrants have welfare, except there's no relation. There's no relation between the demand for welfare and the spending on welfare. Incidentally, there's something no one knows about that was passed under Clinton called the PRWNOA, I believe. There's letters like that, which restricts federal welfare payments to immigrants for 5 years. It cuts them off. Federal money cannot go for the major programs, aid to dependent children and all these things. They're not illegally allowed because something passed under the Clinton administration to give federal funds to immigrants for 5 years after they come in. But no one knows about that. So it's just factually false. It's factually false that we lose jobs. They contribute to our standard of living. It's factually true that they raise the amount of money the government takes in. They do not. So I'm a big proponent of open immigration, and property rights are one of the reasons. The person has the right to use his home, to sell it to, or rent it to, or invite in anyone from anywhere at any time. By the way, you have to separate two questions: immigration and citizenship. I'm not in favor of easy paths to citizenship for immigrants. And immigrants don't care about that. They don't care about voting. They care about jobs. They care about earning money. They care about getting away from drug cartels that are destroying their neighborhoods and killing their children. So I don't say that we should give open citizenship. I'm not in favor of that. That's an entirely different question. So the next question, Dylan?
Yeah, this is another one from Michael. Were people this anti-immigration when you were growing up in the South? What was your experience with segregation? And did your parents often say the N-word?
That's a very interesting question I'm happy to speak on. No, they were not anti-immigration at all. I don't recall any sentiment, but there wasn't immigration. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, and there were hardly any immigrants in my area, but I don't recall any prejudice against immigrants. This was called the melting pot. There were, this being America. America was known, I read that in my textbook in civics class. We're the melting pot. People from all nationalities come here and blend into Americans. We were taught, in the general atmosphere was, look how silly it was. Back in the past, they thought the Italians were scum and they should not have Italians here. They thought the Irish were savages and the Irish should not be let in. And now we understand that that's okay and we're not ignorant like they were in the past. So no, people were not anti-immigrant in my experience in my part of the country. Now, I grew up in the South. What was your experience with segregation? Total segregation. Total. Blacks could not go to the movie theaters I went to. There were no blacks allowed in my high school or any other school I attended. There were, of course, colored water fountains and white water fountains. There were movie theaters and stores, and you could not shop if you were black in a white store. Monument Avenue in Richmond, as we now know, is lined with the quote heroes, the traitors of the Civil War. And we were instructed, and it took me decades to get this out of me, we were instructed never call it the Civil War. It was the war between the states. If you call it the Civil War, you're granting the premise that we didn't have the right to secede. But we did secede. We did have the right, states' rights. We seceded and formed our own nation. And so it was a war of between states. It was not a civil war. Well, that's all wrong. And since then, I've read the Declaration of Secession from South Carolina and a few other states, and it's all about slavery. Openly about slavery. We're seceding because they want to encourage their slaves to revolt, and they don't recognize their right to hold slaves. And we were taught, no, it wasn't about slavery. It was about tariffs and it was states' rights, some kind. There are no states' rights. There's no such thing. So did your parents often say the N-word? Never. Never. They were civilized in culture, but they were racist. There's a long but funny story about when I came back from my freshman year at MIT. I had met a guy from Harvard who was black but was from Richmond, and I made plans to visit him. And when my mother found out, she was horrified. You can't go there. Of course, I went there. And her defense was, well, your father was worse than I was. So there was a lot of racism. It was kept quiet. And I never heard the N-word said, in polite society. So I had a terrible experience with segregation in that it was everywhere. I left when I was 16. So I wasn't really old enough to independently judge it. It was just the way things were, and I didn't think about it until I got to college. And of course, now I'm totally against the Confederacy, which I regard as an evil movement. Next.
A question from the Analytic Synthetic Dichotomy. They ask, I heard the claim that the good constitutes an axiomatic concept. I'm not sure whether that's right. The right way to think of the good. What is your opinion?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that, because I once asked Ayn Rand that. I was kind of working with a theory that maybe, not that good is an axiomatic concept, but that it's the axiom of ethics. And she didn't agree with that idea at all, and I think she was right. Good can be defined. Axiomatic concepts are basic, if they're the axioms of all knowledge, like existence, consciousness, identity, they can't be defined. They're primitives. Now, maybe what the person is talking about is the G.E. Moore theory that good is a simple, non-natural quality. That is horrible. That is terrible. Maybe he's not, because he entitles the thing, the analytic synthetic dichotomy. You can define good. You can define it narrowly or broadly. Broadly, the good is that which benefits a goal, which benefits the achievement of the goal. It's a means. To be good for is to be a means to. And by benefit, I mean fuels the achievement of, leads to the achievement of, causally makes it possible to achieve the goal, adds to the achieving the goal, or sustains it. So good can be defined. It's not an axiomatic concept. And it's very important to make the point I just made, because the next step in Ayn Rand's proof is, what is it to be a goal? What is it to be a value? What is it to be something an entity acts, a living organism, the only one that can do it, acts to gain and or keep, such as something can be good as a means towards that. It's something that serves the existence, the continued existence, i.e. the life of that organism. That's the only way to talk about objective ends versus things that look like ends but really are just mechanical cause and effect. That's a big subject. I wrote my doctoral dissertation in that area, and I've lectured on it. I'm just hinting at it here. So no, it's not only not an axiomatic concept. It's very important to ask, what does it presuppose? And you'll find what does good presuppose rests upon the alternative of life or death. The life or death of the person acting or the organism acting. Next.
Question from Dave Goodman. He asked, should the police have to get a warrant before they can search your car?
Yes. Yes. The power of the state and of the police as the kind of entering wedge in your life of the state, power of the state has to be strictly circumscribed. They can only do what they're allowed. You can do anything that's not prohibited. But the government officials who are the ones wielding force can only do what they are authorized to do explicitly. Everything else is forbidden to them. You are forbidden from doing certain specific things like robbing, murdering, kidnapping. Everything else you can do. So, yes, as part of keeping the state within bounds, you have to make the police subject to very strict control. But I don't want to sound anti-police. I am very pro-police. And I look with horror on the left's attack on the police. I'm a supporter of police, but proper policing is narrowly curtailed by a strict set of, like a legal straitjacket almost. So they can only do what you know they're going to do, and it's going to be in protection of rights. There's a broader point here, which maybe I'll just hint at. You have to have evidence of a threat before, that is you being the government or a private individual. Threat of force before you can act. An objective threat. And this goes back to the immigration. Okay, let's say that in the anti-immigrationist wildest nightmare, 20% of the Mexicans coming across the border are gang members or thieves or rapists or whatever. I mean, that's insane. And all you have to do is look at the pictures of the people they're arresting and picking up into Rio Grande to see they're just like you and me. And they got children in their arms. But suppose there were a significant minority from a certain area who are criminals. That doesn't give you the right to violate the rights of the non-criminals. You can find areas in the United States, in slum neighborhoods, where there's just as many criminals per percentage-wise, and that doesn't give you the right to go in, the police or you, the government, to go in and start interrogating people or locking them up or pushing them out. You can't hold the innocent responsible for the crimes of the guilty. A man is innocent or proven guilty. So if they see evidence, like they see a gun barrel in your car in a state where that's not allowed, or liquor even in a state where that's not allowed, or they see, Bank of New York money sack on the next seat, sure, that's grounds for search. They don't need a warrant to search for that. But just that, well, how do we know he isn't a bank robber? How do we know he isn't a smuggler? How do we know he isn't a gang member? You can't let the police act without evidence. There has to be an objective threat. But if there is a doctrine. If something's in plain sight, they don't have to open your car and go through it. It's in plain sight. They can act on that evidence. Next one.
All right, this one might take a little deciphering.
No, I get it. I've read it. I get it. Read it for the audience, though.
What about a corporation as a collective ownership and collective mind acting through the legal entity of the corporate structure?
The corporation is a vehicle for individual share owners to achieve limited liability and act in cooperation with each other. It's nothing collective. Cooperation is not collectivity. Collectivism is a herd with no rights, no procedures, just a mob. That's a collective. A corporation has founding articles of corporation that specifies what each person's rights and responsibilities as a shareholder are, what the voting will be, and as for limited liability, it has nothing to do with corporations. You can have limited liability. All you need to do is put people on notice. I will not be responsible for debts beyond the amount of money that I'm putting up there. And there's now something called a PC, a professional corporation, where you can be a one-person corporation and get legal liability. But the issue of legal liability, which is a club used to hit corporations over the head with, has nothing essentially to do with corporations. It's putting people on notice. When you deal with me, you cannot go after assets beyond this amount. And then if you don't like that, you don't deal with them. So you can limit your liability in all your transactions too. So the corporation is not collective. There's no collective mind. It's a cooperative thing. Cooperation is an individualist joining a voluntary association under rules that you sign up for and embrace because you want it. And the economic function of a corporation is to separate ownership from control, something that's hurled as a charge against corporation. It means that the little old lady in Pasadena who socked away $1,000 can help fuel the progress of this company by investing in a corporation, and she doesn't have to know anything particular about the running of that corporation. So it's a way of gaining capital from a large group of people. If we didn't have the ability to go public and raise funds on a large scale, economic growth would be drastically curtailed. It would still go on, but it would be much, much slower. So it's a wonderful thing, has nothing to do with limited liability per se, and it is not collectivism, it's individualism. So have any questions come in, or we're over? So
yeah, we do have 4 more. So
we do. All right, well, we'll talk about them possibly for next time, and I hope to have a guest to discuss some of the interesting applications of the use to ownership in the future idea, use rights leading to full ownership rights idea next time. So thank you very much for attending, and I'll see you next Monday.